1917, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. The long lines in front of the mausoleum may have disappeared, but the Kremlin has remained the center of power. It is led by Vladimir Putin, the president of the Russian Federation. He rules over a country that, even without the former Soviet republics, is still the largest in the world: Russia. In the Kremlin, a new government has long since taken over. But across the country, the old symbols are as powerful as ever. The legacy of the former Soviet Union is a complex one. The Soviet Empire covered a sixth of the Earth's surface and was home to 280 million people. The collapse of this giant superstate in 1991 was an event unprecedented in history. A superpower abolished itself. Since then, 15 new states have been struggling to find their place in the world order. Some have gravitated towards Western Europe, while others look to China. But all are defined by their relationship to Russia. Instead of the red Soviet banner, today the Russian flag flies over the Kremlin. The collapse of the Soviet Union brought hopes of independence and prosperity for the former Soviet republics as well. But what remains of these dreams? What does this new freedom look like? Which old conflicts have flared up again? Who has won? Who has lost? And what role does Russia play in this post-Soviet power struggle? Moscow today. At first glance, the Russian capital looks much like any Western metropolis. Consumerism is in. But even in wealthy Moscow, the Soviet chapter of history is still not fully closed. The past has left a deep impression, leading many to ask, what was good in Soviet times, and what has changed for the better?
Everyone believed that things would continue to get better because of democracy.
Armenia, the smallest of the former Soviet republics, no longer even shares a border with Russia. At the military cemetery in the capital Yerevan, new graves are constantly being added. They bear witness to ongoing war and suffering. In the Caucasus, a permanent conflict has been raging for decades between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Both sides lay claim to the region of Nagorno-Karabakh, with its majority Armenian population. Fighting over this mountain enclave goes back to Soviet times, when gun battles and pogroms on both sides cost countless lives. For those caught up in the war, the scars run deep. Arvid Avenesian and his son Gevorg are Armenians who live in Nagorno-Karabakh. They were soldiers, like their friend Hraya Hovsepian. Yet they are also civilians. Arvid runs a sports school, his son studies computing, and their friend is a businessman. The most recent fighting ended in defeat, in part because Azerbaijan received military support from Turkey. The prospect of peace with their Azerbaijani neighbors has never seemed more remote than it does today.
Living alongside such an enemy is no longer possible, or at least very unlikely. The joy and pride you saw in people's faces for 30 years has disappeared. The sparkle in their eyes has gone. A lot has changed.
During the 44-day war, no Western country took any concrete measures to help us. But then the Russian army entered the region. With the help of the Russians, the war was stopped. The war zone in the summer of 2021. A fragile ceasefire is in place between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Like here, at this border control point, it is monitored by Russian peacekeepers. Last year, Azerbaijan recaptured significant parts of Nagorno-Karabakh. Armenia was forced to cede the lost territory. These three Armenians meet every day to play chess. They remember the Soviet era and have long since grown weary of war.
"30 years ago, we took their land. Now they've taken it back. If the Russians hadn't come, they would have slaughtered us. That's Islamic law."
Freedom is to blame. Everyone was calling for it. It all began with Karabakh's independence. Lasting peace is still a distant prospect. The people here consider themselves Armenian. The country's flag is always present. Driving with Gagik Eliasyan into the war zone, he is the mayor of a small border village.
We're about to enter a village where the Azerbaijani and Armenian sides are directly facing each other.
Today it is peaceful. 1 year ago, this was the front line where gunfire was exchanged. But beyond the region itself, this war barely registers, despite it lasting for the past 3 decades on Europe's external border.
During the daytime, it's safe here. But at night, it's dangerous. There are people living right over there. To make sure nothing bad happens, we have to monitor the area. The villagers go to work in the day, and at night, they keep watch. That's the border. There are soldiers there. There are Azerbaijanis everywhere.
An old church in the middle of the war zone. The Azerbaijanis are Shiite Muslims, while the Armenians practice Christianity. Their respective religions are an important part of their national identity, and one reason for the decades-old conflict.
The people here, they just want to live in peace.
Armenia is a small country, covering just 30,000 square kilometers. The journey from the border to Yerevan, the capital, is not far. For months, Arvid Avenesian has been bringing his son to the hospital here. Gevorg was badly injured in the war. But in Stepanakert, the capital of Nagorno-Karabakh, long-term care for wounded soldiers is not available.
I was injured on the 21st of October last year by a cluster bomb. It was the very first day that these weapons were deployed. The bombs exploded in the air, and the shrapnel hit me in the head and the back.
After the hospital, father and son visit the cemetery together. The last heavy fighting in 2020 saw thousands more soldiers lose their lives. Many of them still very young, barely even adults.
Just because they're no longer in this world doesn't mean they are no longer with us. As long as we are alive, so are they.
The conflict in the Caucasus has had far-reaching consequences. NATO member Turkey supports the Muslim nation of Azerbaijan. France, however, is on the side of the Armenians. Russia is attempting to remain neutral. After all, Moscow values good relations with the oil-rich Azerbaijan. This is not how the Armenians imagined their freedom and independence. "30 years ago, 15 Soviet republics became independent states. One day part of Soviet territory, the next foreign countries.
How can you see Ukrainians, Belarusians, or Armenians as foreigners and these places as foreign countries? It's very difficult. In Russia, foreign policy expertise in regard to post-Soviet space is very weak. Even the experts acknowledge this. This sounds strange and paradoxical. They were part of the same country for so many years. But the Foreign Ministry has only a few experts for Ukraine, Belarus, and the Caucasus. There are far more who specialize in the USA, Germany, France, or the Benelux countries.
A complex legacy. Despite the dissolution, the old dependencies continued to exist. The entire infrastructure of roads and railways, power lines, and oil and gas pipelines was built according to the needs of the Soviet Union and its centralized power base in Moscow. The Institute of Economics at the Academy of Sciences is examining the relationships to Moscow, as they were and as they are now. Ruslan Grinberg is the Institute's director. This longtime confidant of Mikhail Gorbachev has reached a simple conclusion.
You have to understand that all states of the post-Soviet region have one single principle when it comes to their relationship with Russia. And it's been this way for 30 years, achieving a maximum of economic advantage from Russia while having a minimum of political obligations.
The Soviet Union was formed in 1922 as a joining together of the Union republics, voluntarily. At least this is how it was framed in the Constitution. But the right to secede from the Union had never been tried in practice, and certainly not a withdrawal of all its members. But in 1991, that is what happened. The country dissolved into its constituent parts. The West looked on, amazed at the rapid disintegration, and 25 million Russians were left in shock. They suddenly found themselves inhabitants of other countries, compounded by the uncertainty of whether they would be accepted there as citizens or be allowed to keep their homes and land. Vladislav Belov is the director at the Center of German Studies. He is no political ally of Vladimir Putin, but he agrees with the president's claim that the fall of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century.
One can agree with his statement, if by geopolitics you primarily mean the interests of certain people. And if we consider the fates of millions of those who, due to the unconstitutional, I repeat, unconstitutional dissolution of the USSR, found themselves trapped behind the borders of the country in which they thought they lived, I'm talking about 25 million Russian-speaking citizens who, overnight, woke up to find themselves living in another country. Today, we are in one country. Tomorrow, we wake up and find ourselves in another. These people were treated as second class. And that is, of course, a catastrophe.
At first, there were attempts to rebuild the ruins. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Tauride Palace in St. Petersburg was to become the seat of the Commonwealth of Independent States, a loose organization of the former Soviet republics. However, the 3 Baltic states, Georgia and Ukraine, withdrew or chose not to participate. And the Commonwealth of the remaining states exists only on paper. No summits have been held in years. The CIS has no power. Gerhard Mangot works at the University of Innsbruck in Austria and is one of the West's most renowned Russia experts. He also sees the CIS as a failed attempt to continue the legacy of the Soviet Union.
Although in Moscow
under Yeltsin there was certainly the expectation that some kind of confederation would be possible. But as the Armenian president said at the time, this confederation of independent states was more like a vehicle for an amicable divorce. And indeed, that's all it was. It's incredible that this association still exists today, at least on paper, because no one wants to kill the baby, as it were, by dissolving the organization entirely. But it simply has no practical political significance anymore.
The Baltic states played a special role. Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania were the first to break away from the Soviet Union and successfully pursue their own path. Their relationship to Russia is frosty. Vilnius, the Lithuanian capital. The viewing platform of the TV tower is a popular attraction. From here, one can see how the city has changed. In the last 20 years alone, around 50,000 new apartments have been built, more than anywhere else in the Baltic states. In the center is the country's parliament. Since independence, it is known again as the Seimas. Ruslanas Baranovas is a philosophy graduate and works for an MP of the Social Democrat Party.
We've integrated into the European Union and the West, and our living standards have increased. The borders were opened up for us, and many Lithuanians emigrated to Western Europe. But at the same time, our main problem is inequality. Inequality of incomes, unequal opportunities.
30 years ago, Lithuania was home to 3.7 million inhabitants. But then the exodus began. 900,000 Lithuanians left the country. Young people especially, most of them well-educated, went to find work in the West, a huge problem for this small republic. Despite this, the capital and the country as a whole has embraced the modern world. Annual economic growth has long been around 3%, and Lithuania has one of the best fiberglass internet networks in all of Europe. But Lithuanians also have a strong sense of national history and identity. These photos in the parliament recall the independence movement of 1989.
Our history is our guide, and many things that are going on in society now are linked to our past. The goal of our security and foreign policy is to make sure that history does not repeat itself.
Lithuania has long felt part of the West. An exhibition about the so-called Forest Brothers, partisans who fought against the Soviet occupation until 1953, is currently on display at the Seimas. The younger generation can take democracy for granted. Emil Paskochimaite studied educational science in Germany, but Vilnius has remained her home.
I was talking about this with my grandparents just yesterday. We were discussing what we have gained after 30 years of independence. My grandparents said just one thing, that we can express our opinions freely, that we live in a free country. My generation and young people in general are often told, even my parents say this, that we don't know what freedom is, Because we've never lived in a country without freedom, we can't appreciate what freedom means. Because we can just get on with our lives and believe this is normal. And this is probably true.
Emil belongs to an organization that wants to influence the political discourse in Lithuania, Jaunimo debatai, youth debate.
Through our work here in Lithuania, we organize programs that are supported by the European Union. So every day, I am living the values of the European Union. I consider myself to be more, if I'm allowed to say this, a citizen of Europe.
Lithuania's ties to the West are becoming closer every year. In 2004, the country joined NATO, along with its Baltic neighbors, Estonia and Latvia, and 4 other members of the former Eastern Bloc. Military spending in Lithuania now makes up around 2% of GDP. In 2021, NATO carried out exercises here, reflecting a deep mistrust of Russia, another legacy of the Soviet era. But the Baltic countries are home to a large Russian minority who do not want to give up their identity. Ruslanas knows this well. His own father is Russian.
I think Russian influence today takes on a more hybrid form, such as influence over television, which a lot of people in Lithuania still watch, and over the internet. For many people, Russian is the only foreign language they know. And so if they want any information beyond what's provided by Lithuanian TV and websites, they'll go straight to the Russian platforms.
Lithuania sees Russia as a potential aggressor and is counting on support from NATO and the European Union. In Moscow, there is little sympathy for this position. Not even at the influential and critical journal Россия в глобальной политике, Russia in Global Affairs.
If I were Polish or from one of the Baltic countries, I might also see things that way. But when you look at it from a rational perspective, it's not at all clear why Russia would attack Poland or the Baltic states. What would it achieve? The idea that Russia wants to test NATO's readiness and thereby prove its incapability is, in my opinion, complete fantasy. Of course, we don't agree with NATO, but no one here wants to risk another world war just to test NATO. What would be the point?
Putin is nevertheless demonstrating Russia's military strength by carrying out its own maneuvers on the borders to the NATO countries. Tension is building on both sides. Military marches in front of the Kremlin. The message: Russians should be proud of their army, while the West and NATO should be deterred. The country is a fortress under siege, says Putin, so its people must stand together. Last year, Russia spent 4.3% of its GDP on its military.
Under Yeltsin, the army was humiliated, insulted, underfinanced, and its soldiers left to starve. When Putin came to power in 2000, it was suddenly paradise on earth. There was peace and happiness. And today, we have a strong army and military careers are desirable again. This is all part of the propaganda.
The imperial mindset of the former Soviet Union persists in Russia today, legitimized through the victory of the Red Army over Hitler's Germany in the Second World War. 27 million dead. The Great Patriotic War, as the Russians call it, has left its mark on almost every family. Among Russians, but also Ukrainians, Belarusians, Kazakhs, and Kyrgyz. These memories also shape today's society.
This belief that we Russians are a significant power, one that can push back against hostile pressure and hostile influences from the outside world, this is an important part of our collective identity. This belief in the Soviet Union and Russia's unique authority, and that we are a special civilization, This compensates for the feelings of dependence, poverty, and humiliation that people have in their private lives.
What might seem strange for Western visitors is for Russians completely normal. A mural of Georgy Shukov, the great Second World War commander, proudly overlooking an inner-city shopping street. This modern-day veneration of wartime heroes sends another message. Never again will this once glorious army present such a shameful image to the world as it did after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Today, Russia is showing its strength again, investing in new atomic weapons. The military-industrial complex established in Soviet times is now experiencing a renaissance. But the country as a whole is paying a heavy price.
The political leadership is making the mistake of believing that a 21st century superpower needs only to define itself militarily. And Russia is only a superpower in military terms, not economically, not financially, not technologically, and not demographically.
The purchasing power of the Russian people is increasing at a slower rate than almost anywhere in Europe. Still, some slight growth is currently predicted for the Russian economy. But that is mainly due to higher commodity prices. Russia's companies are simply not innovative enough. There is barely any investment in infrastructure. Many of the country's transport arteries are in a state of disrepair.
I regret that we have not been able to achieve an economic miracle of the kind seen in China, at least in terms of transport infrastructure. We still only have one motorway, from Moscow to St. Petersburg. It's an embarrassment. Our main transport route towards the east, connecting Moscow with Beijing, is still being rebuilt. It's an embarrassment. Moscow, well, yes, Moscow has changed. But I expected to see this all over Russia, for roads and infrastructure to be improved across the country. The money has disappeared, but nothing has been built.
Now Russia is looking for strong partners, all the more so since relations with Western Europe have cooled. Russia and China are working together on the huge intercontinental project known as the New Silk Road. Hopes are high for large profits and growth.
China is pursuing a very cautious policy towards Russia by not actively letting Russia feel that it's the junior partner, at least in economic and financial matters. Because historically, China has always been, and still is, afraid that Russia can easily switch sides and align itself with the West. And this should be prevented at all costs.
Russia has refocused its attention on Central Asia in order to secure its traditional sphere of influence. The Central Asian republics have welcomed this, in large part as a counterweight to China, their increasingly dominant neighbor. Yet the opposite is true in Ukraine, where the majority of the country looks to the west rather than the east. Of all the former Soviet republics, Ukraine was probably best placed to make a success of its independence. But today, the country finds itself in crisis. President Volodymyr Zelensky has failed to fulfill his people's hopes for peace and prosperity. Ukraine today is the most corrupt country in Europe, making a formal alliance with Western Europe extremely difficult. The country is deeply divided. While people in Western Ukraine overwhelmingly support joining NATO and the European Union, the east of the country feels a strong connection with Russia. Especially in Luhansk and Donetsk, regions industrialized during the Soviet era. Known as Donbass, was home to protests against the national government in Kiev. A pro-Russian minority took issue with the Ukrainian state, propelled by fears that they would be discriminated against in a Western-leaning nationalist Ukraine. Ethnic Russians make up a large minority of the population. 8 million out of 42 million citizens. With backing from Russia, these protests turned into a separatist uprising, a civil war that has set the whole of Europe on edge and shows no signs of abating.
Donbass was never Ukrainian in terms of language and traditions. My mother comes from eastern Ukraine. She comes from the Zaporozhian Cossacks who settled along the Don. When I visited her village as a 5-year-old, I didn't understand a word. So who am I exactly? My mother is Ukrainian, my father is Russian. For my wife's parents, it's the other way around. My mother-in-law comes from western Ukraine, a 100% Zapadnetska. Her husband is Russian. So, who are we?
In 2014, the Crimean Peninsula in southern Ukraine became the scene of an escalation in the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. Today, Russia claims Crimea as a part of its federation. A huge new bridge is being built to connect the peninsula to the Russian mainland. It's intended to send a message to the world. We have taken back Crimea. It's a show of strength towards former Soviet states, demonstrating what happens if they turn against Russia. Orchestrated by Moscow, the overwhelmingly ethnic Russian population had already elected a separatist parliament. This led to the annexation of the territory by Russia. What Western Europe saw as a flagrant breach of international law was presented by Russia as a free decision by the majority of people in Crimea.
This was a real election. I admit probably not everything was carried out in line with international law. But this was not a military occupation. It was not an annexation. It was a declaration of will by the people.
In Russia, it is hard to find anyone who does not consider Crimea to be a part of Russian territory. A new Russian patriotism has taken hold 30 years after the fall of the Soviet Union. For some, perhaps also encouraged by memories of its former greatness. We were a large country. We still are a large country. That's just a fact.
That's where my parents fell in love, and everything positive that they associate with their lives back then, they also associate with the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, people were tricked. Those in power promised one thing, but did something completely different.
It was a very simplistic idea of what the future would bring. We will drive out the communists will disappear, and a new life will be possible. A better life. Everyone thought that the good parts of socialism, which used to be, would remain, and that these benefits would be supplemented by two new aspects. Firstly, consumer choice, and secondly, freedom. And that, together, would be perfect happiness.
The transition from a socialist command economy to a capitalist market economy was abrupt and came almost without warning. Anna Orumyan is today a successful business consultant. For her, what occurred back then was akin to shock therapy.
You have to understand that we'd been living inside the Soviet system. The right to private ownership was not recognized. Even today, we have a very specific relationship to property rights and entrepreneurship in Russia. So imagine what it was like back then. For people who had been concerned with completely different matters, like science or culture, and then suddenly forced to become or decided to become business owners, because they wanted to somehow live and survive. Privatization was a part of this shock therapy.
The privatization was chaotic and forced through without regard for the consequences. At the end of the 1990s, Russia was plunged into a major economic crisis. For older people in particular, memories of this time are painful. The ruble was dramatically devalued. GDP halved. Child mortality rose to frightening new levels, and life expectancy was shorter than in the Third World. all compounded by unprecedented corruption at the highest levels of power.
All das hat in den Augen der meisten Russen und
All
Russinnen
this discredited the
das Wort
concept of
Demokratie,
democracy
das ganze Konzept
and the very
Demokratie
term democracy in the eyes of most Russians.
gewissermaßen fast so ein
Democracy almost
Schimpfwort
became a dirty
angesichts der
word due to the experiences people had with the transition to a supposedly democratic system during the 1990s.
gemacht hat. Und wir sehen eigentlich heute
And even today,
dass
we see surveys from independent institutes
unabhängige Institute
that suggest only around a fifth of Russian people would like to live in a Western-style democracy.
Demokratie nach westlichem Vorbild zu installieren.
But what do ordinary Russians think of their country? One of the best-known public polling institutes, the Levada Center, regularly poses this question. The center operates free of state control and is therefore treated with suspicion.
When at the end of the Yeltsin era, we asked Russians what they expected from the next president, most people expressed two hopes. First, that the country would find a way out of the economic crisis and achieve an increase in living standards. And second, that Russia would be restored to the position of superpower that it held during the USSR. And Putin, with his demagogy, his rhetoric, his strengthening of the military and the country's power structures, seemed ready to fulfill these expectations.
Vladimir Putin's first term in office began in 2000, and he immediately tightened the reins. To the country's powerful oligarchs, he made clear that a new era had arrived. He promised that they would be free to go about their business unhindered, and that their companies would not be renationalized. In return, they would grant him their unwavering loyalty. His message was this: stay out of politics, and I will leave you in peace. Most Russians applauded this. The current ruling party achieves its political aims much like the old Communist Party did, through domination.
It's like the old joke that was going around under Yeltsin. Whichever party we create, we'll always end up with the communists. So there's no alternative. On the other hand, the Russian political establishment, the Russian power structure, is much more flexible than the Soviet one. It is capitalist.
But not only Russia has a highly centralized authoritarian government. Take Belarus, nestled between Russia and the European Union. Due to their shared history and related languages, Belarus was always a reliable ally for Russia. Now it appears shaky. Even the national flag makes no secret of the country's close ties to its Soviet past. Only the hammer, sickle, and star have been replaced. Reminders of the Soviet Union are ubiquitous, both in the capital Minsk and across the country. The country's economy is centrally controlled with a mixture of private and state ownership. An absence of democratic structures and high levels of media censorship have earned it international condemnation. Since 1994, Belarus has been ruled continuously by the autocrat Alexander Lukashenko, a one-time Soviet political officer. Since his re-election in 2020, opposition to his government has become louder. Hundreds of thousands of Belarusians have taken to the streets, demanding democracy and Lukashenko's resignation. In Kazakhstan, too, a president with autocratic tendencies has ruled for many years, yet with other, and for Russia, more favorable conditions. Thanks to its oil and gas supplies, Kazakhstan is the richest country in the region. Its long-serving former leader, Nursultan Nazarbayev, was a member of the Politburo of the Communist Party in Soviet times. Unlike Kazakhstan, the once poor Soviet republics of Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, and Tajikistan initially struggled with their new freedom. They were too dependent on the centralized seat of power in Moscow. Millions of people from the former Soviet republics in Central Asia have come to Russia as migrant workers, especially to the cities of Moscow and St. Petersburg. They work on building sites, in the service sector, or in agriculture. People from the Caucasus, meanwhile, often work as itinerant traders. Their wages are usually the most important source of income for their families back home. Most foreign workers come from here, Kyrgyzstan. In the capital, Bishkek, life is shaped both by Islam and the legacies of the Soviet era. A suburb of Bishkek, early in the morning. In one of these houses lives Rita Igashova. She is a tailor by trade. Her husband and 2 of her 5 children live and work in Russia. She also spent several years there. Together with her daughter, Saltanat, she is taking the bus to work at the market. Here, Rita owns a small shop selling lingerie, bought with savings from her work in Russia.
Без России, мне кажется, мы не сможем жить. Все равно
I don't believe that Kyrgyzstan can survive without Russia. All the former countries of the CIS should be on friendly terms,
все равно
and they should maintain these important links in the future. Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, all of them.
Узбекистан, Таджикистан, Казахстан, все равно. У нас вот почти 2 миллиона.
Over 2 million Kyrgyz are Russian citizens and are working there.
Работают.
My daughter and my son have decided to stay there. Every family has someone who works in Russia, whether it's the husband, wife, daughter or son.
Islam in the country is a recently revived legacy of pre-Soviet times. Nearby is an imposing Russian Orthodox church. National heroes from centuries past are revered, as are others from the more recent Soviet era. Kyrgyzstan has 6.5 million inhabitants. 800,000 of them are ethnic Russians. Alongside Kyrgyz, Russian is also an official language here. Rita cannot understand why so many of her fellow Kyrgyz are embracing Islam. Under pressure from Muslim men, more and more women no longer go out to work, instead accepting to stay at home and be housewives.
Мне кажется, при Советском Союзе было больше.
I think women's rights were better in the Soviet Union. Women were more equal. Today, women are becoming more religious, wearing headscarves or veils. I don't like that. They don't have a voice anymore. Do you understand? They have no identity.
Сейчас женщины, многие сейчас они, нет у них голоса, понимаешь? Своего я дегендей.
The south of the country is home to many Uzbeks. In the past, there have been outbreaks of violence between them and the Kyrgyz. One reason, their differing expressions of religious faith. The Uzbeks tend to follow a very strict interpretation of Islam, while the Kyrgyz are more moderate.
Islam is important for everyone, but of course it mustn't be too strict. No, not too strict.
Religion. The most important thing is our humanity. Religion is secondary to that. Today, Islam is allowed to shine again in Kyrgyzstan. In Jalalabad, the imam is the Uzbek Alaya Madaliyev. He completed his theology studies back in Soviet times. As imam, the 66-year-old is not only a religious leader, but also a kind of mayor in his local district.
In my opinion, life in the Soviet Union was good. There was religious freedom, and religion was valued. The state didn't interfere, and it respected religious boundaries. They didn't monitor us as much and tell us what to do. A proper religion was preached. There were no banned or terrorist organizations back then, no Hezbis, Wahhabis, or Salafists, and we never preached anything that was forbidden. We taught how to pray correctly and how the faithful should treat one another. But today, there are more extremist organizations, and the state must be more careful.
Kyrgyzstan defines itself as a secular state. Yet there's no telling how strong an influence a radical form of Islam could become here. Imam Madaliyev preaches a moderate interpretation of the faith. Every Friday, the mosques are full.
Religious freedom in Kyrgyzstan is very good. Other countries don't have this level of religious freedom. There are no barriers to practicing our faith. There's a mosque in every neighborhood here.
In the atheist Soviet Union, the imam was a civil servant and earned a monthly salary. Today, he earns his income through the mosque's own bakery and a butcher's shop. He receives donations and runs a small farm. Even he, the imam, must head out to the fields after work each day to gather hay. This is the reality of life for a religious leader in Kyrgyzstan. Alaya Madaliyev misses the Soviet Union.
In the Soviet Union, everyone was equal. Rich and poor were on the same level. Even I, as an imam, earned 80 rubles a month. These days, everyone is divided up into rich and poor.
Back in the capital, Bishkek, this building houses the headquarters of a local NGO. One of the activists is Dinara Oshura-Khunova. These women are campaigning for more democracy and against corruption.
У нас, к сожалению, коррупция достигла очень большого размаха.
Corruption here has reached new heights. It's out of control. The people in power are there, in my opinion, primarily to enrich themselves and not to govern or to help the country. They want to turn politics into a business opportunity for themselves.
The fact that an NGO can publicly promote its goals in this way distinguishes Kyrgyz society from other countries in Central Asia. But Dinara, a Russian language teacher by profession, wants to get even more involved. She supports the new Reform Party because, as she says, there are too few truly democratic parties in Kyrgyzstan.
At the last elections, there were 78 different parties on the ballot, but only 3, 4 or 5 of them are democratic and liberal, and that is concerning. That's why such new parties are important. There is a demand for more new parties in our society.
At the edges of this once multi-ethnic state, the Russian army has long seen itself as a guarantor of stability. Since the end of the Soviet Union, these border regions have been the sites of violent power struggles, often with the participation of Russian troops, such as here in the now autonomous Chechen Republic.
The Chechen wars were viewed very negatively by the wider population, both the first and the second. Around 55 to 65% of Russians saw these wars as unjust and felt it important that they should be ended as quickly as possible.
The journalist Anna Politkovskaya had reported for years on the brutality of the Chechen War and corruption at the upper levels of the Russian army. In October 2006, she was shot dead in front of her Moscow apartment block. Was her assassination ordered by political circles around the Kremlin, or was the Chechen leadership responsible? Despite trials and sentences handed down, the real masterminds were never identified. The killing was seen in Russia as a warning to critics of the regime.
But if we look at the situation clearly and objectively, there is really no serious opposition in Russia that could pose major difficulties for the Kremlin or be considered a threat. The principle of show strength and crush dissent obviously works.
This principle recalls the power mechanisms of Soviet times. In the 1960s, the term Homo Sovieticus was coined, the Soviet citizen defined by conformist values and attitudes. Many people in the former Soviet republics remain shaped by these fundamental values even today.
The Soviet citizen developed the skills required to survive in a repressive state. He learned to deceive the state, to tolerate its arbitrary judgments, to feign loyalty towards it, all while taking care of his own problems and trying to survive in this hard and repressive environment. The advent of Putin and his authoritarian system was no accident, but rather a continuation of the Soviet regime.
There is only one real difference to the Soviet Union. Today, the blessing no longer comes from a single, all-powerful party. Putin, the one-time member of the Communist Party, now has the backing of a different authority, the Russian Orthodox Church. The Church has no objection to the strengthening of conservative values in Russia. "30 years ago, the red flag of the Soviet Union was taken down from the Kremlin. Hardly anyone objected.
We entered Red Square, 300 people, who had come to speak out against this astonishing decision. And there were 287 million people in the USSR. I always say, for 1 million citizens, only a single person showed up to protect the Soviet Union. It was very strange.
Russia is the largest of the successor states. It is still struggling to find its place between Europe and Asia.
The developments of the past 30 years have been confusing and difficult. As a result, Russia has regained its status as a global political player. But at the same time, it's fallen far short of where it could be today with a more visionary leadership.
Western European-style democracy is not a model Russia is trying to emulate. Pride in Russia's greatness and an appeal to its shared traditions. These are what will make the country strong.
That's why there is such a longing for one's childhood, for the school years, for our time as students. But that's not much about the Soviet Union. Putin was right when he said, anyone who doesn't mourn the Soviet Union has no heart, but anyone who would go back to what it was has no head.
30 years later, the dreams of the past have been replaced by new realities. Whether the collapse of the Soviet Union really was a geopolitical catastrophe, or rather a new opportunity that some of its former states have been slow to grasp, only time will tell.